Andrew Jackson was born on March 15, 1767. He was 13 when the American Revolution happened. His family came from Ireland, and Jackson was born in South Carolina. During this time, there was no South or North Carolina. Jackson's father would die when he was young, leaving his mother to care for him and his siblings. This is where Jackson would have his first kills when the American Revolution took place. Jackson would lose his brothers and mother due to sickness and war. At age 20, Jackson received benefits from his deceased grandfather. It was at this time that Andrew Jackson became a lawyer. This led him to becoming more wealthy, and with more money came gambling for him. Jackson was also called a rake, which is someone who is immoral and a womanizing deviant. Eventually, the money would dry up, and he would burn every bridge he made with the community. He would eventually leave to Tennessee, which is back when Andrew Jackson lived there, which was, at the time, new, inexpensive, and easy to make it. In 1788, at the age of 21, Jackson would become a prosecutor and meet his first wife, Rachel, a woman who was already married. They would marry in 1791, and Rachel would get divorced from her husband from before 2 years later, in 1793. Over time, Jackson would buy 9 slaves and would regularly beat them, intimidating his enemies and those who dared to oppose him. Jackson would make examples of his slaves in public, humiliating and savagely beating them whenever the opportunity presented itself. At the age of 24, he became the Attorney General of Tennessee. Within 5 years, Jackson would become a senator. Andrew Jackson was chosen to be a judge in the Supreme Court. Jackson would hold the position for close to 6 years. This is when Andrew Jackson would sharpen his intimidation skills and hunt down lawbreakers. Eventually, Jackson would be elected Tennessee militia leader. This didn't sit well with his opponent in the race, John Sevier. The more qualified of the two made petty remarks about Jackson's wife, and Jackson reacted by shooting at John. Eventually, the two agreed to a duel. John would never show up to the duel, so Jackson hunted down John and beat him until John pleaded with Jackson to spare his life.
Andrew Jackson for African Americans is not the sort of figure that one holds very dear. He wouldn't form part of the ranks of the great men of American society because never in his reign as president, in his terms as president, did he ever attempt to expand the rights of people. On the contrary, he did everything he could, it seems to me, to constrict those rights, to limit those rights.
Around 1804, Jackson bought a cotton plantation where he would live out the rest of his life in. Jackson would increase his slave count. Jackson was constantly beating his slaves and engaging in barbaric tortures to send messages to his adversaries. In 1806, Andrew Jackson duels with Charles Dickinson over a comment Dickinson made about Rachel, Jackson's wife.
Dickinson had said something about Rachel Jackson, and here's something else that Jackson is very sensitive about, because his whole marriage to Rachel had been under a cloud from the beginning, and anybody to raise that point in any direct or even indirect way would trigger a very violent response.
The rules state that you only get one shot. Dickinson shot Jackson in the chest. Jackson pulls the trigger, but his gun jammed. When the gun jams, you don't get to shoot again. Jackson pulls the trigger again, defying the rules and killing Dickinson.
Today, some Americans look back at Jackson and they see the slaveholder, the Indian oppressor, even the Indian hater. So the debate about Andrew Jackson is a very contemporary one. He's an inescapable, quintessential American, but of what kind? Is he a man whom we should admire, or is he a man whom we should despise? Is he a man whom we should celebrate, or is he a man for whom we should apologize?
People talk about Andrew Jackson's black moods. People talk about Andrew Jackson's red-hot temper. But the color of this story is green, and it's the green of envy, and it's the green of coveting Indian land.
The Creek War was also known as the Red Stick War and was a war between Creek factions, European empires, and the United States. It takes largely place in Alabama along the Gulf Coast in 1813. Andrew Jackson got a letter about the massacre on white people. After white settlers began attacking the Creeks burned down an entire town to send a message to the white settlers and the United States government, who was trying to take their land by force. Andrew Jackson took men and headed to one of the towns inhabited by Creeks, where Andrew Jackson began murdering everyone he could, and his men did the same. It was said that there were at least 10 dead Native Americans for every cabin. Andrew Jackson set fire to the town afterwards. It was also rumored that Andrew Jackson and his men ate the flesh of their victims. It's never been confirmed. Davy Crockett was also in the massacre and said, quote, "We shot them like dogs," end quote. Andrew Jackson wouldn't stop at a full-blown massacre. He would go on to slaughter as many Creek Native Americans as he could, even the ones who surrendered and fled. Andrew Jackson ordered his men to slaughter them, and it was said that a river ran red with their blood, as many of them tried to flee by water. He ordered his men to cut off every one of the Creek's noses. Andrew Jackson kept the noses as trophies, typical serial killer behavior. Around this time, Andrew Jackson claimed he found a baby that a tribe had attempted to sacrifice because, quote, his parents were dead, unquote. He then made a bold claim that he saved the infant. He took the infant home to his wife Rachel, where he died in his teens. This was also where Andrew Jackson would order executions of his men who refused to continue pursuing and murdering Creeks. Andrew ordered for their arrests, built coffins for the men, and had them executed by a firing squad in the coffins. He had the men shot in front of all of his men to prove a point. Andrew Jackson would end the Creek War at Horseshoe Bend in late March 1814.
After Andrew Jackson defeated the Creek and the British, Andrew Jackson seized the land in Alabama and Georgia and gifted it to the United States government. Fort Jackson was built on the land seized in Lower Georgia. The Creeks who fled to Florida drove Jackson mad. He wanted to exterminate the entire tribe. Jackson would later become a general. He never forgot about the Creeks.
Now tell me, what is happening in Florida?
The Seminoles attack in Georgia and then hide in Spanish Florida. They get guns from the English traders.
The Spanish governor protects everybody.
Including runaway slaves. The people of South Carolina and Georgia won't put up with this much longer.
General Jackson will replace General Gaines. Now, inform him, Mr. Calhoun, and make it clear that he is to seek out the Seminoles wherever he finds them, but under no circumstances is he to attack the Spanish fort.
At this time, Spain was granting freedom to all slaves who fled to Florida. This angered the white settlers, including Andrew Jackson. Jackson waited for his time, eager to conquer Florida, finally exterminate the Creek, and return the slaves to their slavers. At the time, President Monroe was upset about the runaway slaves to Florida. President Monroe sends a letter to Andrew Jackson letting him know about his frustrations about the slaves.
How am I supposed to fight a campaign and win it and still respect the Spanish rights of property? I have to go where the Seminole goes or I can't beat him. All right, John. Scratch that all out now and put this down. I respectfully submit a simple plan for solving the whole of the Seminole Indian problem. I take Florida away from Spain.
This provoked Andrew Jackson, who rounded up his men and attacked Florida. They slaughtered enough people to get attention from the Minister of Spain.
You cannot do this thing. You cannot march in here into Spanish territory and occupy it. You have brought on war.
The Minister of Spain evacuated Florida and asked President Monroe for consequences for Andrew Jackson's actions. The United States did nothing. President Monroe did nothing. Andrew Jackson's killing spree went on without consequence. Andrew Jackson seized all of Florida for the United States.
General Jackson has gone too far. He's ignored the president's orders. We'll have a war on our hands. As Secretary of War, I condemn his action.
And are you of the same opinion, Mr. Crawford?
As Secretary of the Treasury, it is my duty to advise, as Mr. Calhoun has suggested. that Jackson be punished and the Floridas be returned to Spain.
Secretary of State, I disagree. The last thing Spain wants is a war with the United States.
I'm for a complete investigation before a military tribunal.
You would court-martial General Jackson and admit to Spain that we were in the wrong?
He violated the direct instructions of the president.
Did he, Mr. Clay? I think that's still to be decided.
What about the Englishmen he executed?
Spies. They gave guns to the Indians. The British have assured me they will make no protest. And may I add, Mr. President, if we punish the general in any public way, it will give Spain a decided advantage in our bargaining for Florida.
Gentlemen, please. We will offer a price, but not too high either, to buy Florida from Spain. And if they accept, which I think they will, General Jackson will be named the territorial governor.
His murdering spree of Native Americans and conquest of land was only the beginning. Andrew Jackson retired in his early 50s, but would later go on to be the President of the United States and massacre more Native Americans, as well as taking their land and returning more slaves to slavers. In the end, Andrew Jackson was one of the most evil men in American history.